Okay, well, let's get started. Well, welcome everybody and happy Friday. My name is Paul Rukavina. I am Shape America Research Council Chair, and I'm joined by Allie Bryan, who's the past chair, and Nancy Getchell, who is also on the Research Council. And we are sponsoring this virtual session. Today we have Cheryl Coker, Jane Clark, Dale Ulrich, three prominent motor behavior scholars, and we're going to discuss the future of motor behavior in higher education. More specifically, how can motor behavior be translated into evidence-based practices, and how we can make collaboration among scholars and practitioners. We're going to have three 15-minute presentations, and you all have a chance to choose one of the three breakout rooms after the speakers get done speaking. Also, a second purpose for this presentation is to gain interest for the Shape America Motor Behavior Special Interest Group that will be starting. I will put in the chat a Google form so that you can sign up, and so we can start beginning some translation work at Shape America. And so now it's time for our first speaker. I'll pass it over to Cheryl.
All right. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. That's very nice of you to do so. And I'm super excited to be here with Jane and Dale and the organizing committee, Paul, Allie, and Nancy, to promote the creation of a motor behavior SIG, an idea that I fully support. So I'm going to be speaking today from a motor learning perspective, and we thought we would start off just with the Research Council's charge to us. So in preparation for this presentation, we were given three things to consider. First, what our vision was for the future of motor behavior research to practice. Second is how to create evidence-based practice. And then the final consideration was, how can we promote the translation of that information to enhance physical education? So when I was given this, this charge, I immediately was put back in time to when I was a master's degree student. It was my first year in grad school, and I was in motor learning. And an issue of Quest came out, and the focus of that particular special feature was the usefulness of motor learning research for physical educators. And of course, I was very excited because I just, started to embark on a career looking at motor learning. And in that issue, Singer set the stage, and basically he had proposed a question to a series of eminent scholars about whether motor learning research was meaningful for physical educators, or a waste of time. And of course, I thought clearly that this would be a very, positive thing, and everybody would, of course, be jumping on board that motor learning would be just an amazing thing that we should all jump on board with. But there were a number of different opinions about that. And Lockett indicated that he didn't think it was a waste of time, but it didn't really have much of a role in conducting instruction for school settings. And Hoffman followed up with his perspective, thinking that basically what motor learning had been for the last 20 years really didn't have a lot of practical recommendations that could be offered to the practitioner. So I was thinking to myself, well, clearly you have to be able to understand how people learn if you're going to teach them. And Dick McGill, of course, had also indicated that in his paper, that teaching and learning are intimately related. And both he and later Judy Rank argued that understanding various factors that influence motor learning and performance are essential for the development of optimal instructional strategies. So this particular special feature of Quest was really quite influential on my career, and basically how I teach motor learning to my students. So another influential experience that I had was when I was at New Mexico State University, and a friend of mine we were having lunch, and she's like, hey, the football coach came over to my office the other day. And I'm like, really? I'm like, you teach special education. Why did the football coach come over to your office? And she told me that he came over to her office because he was concerned because his players were really slow coming off the line, and he thought that maybe she could help him with that. And her response was, well, have you talked to Cheryl Coker over in physical education? And his immediate response was, well, I already know how to coach football. And that kind of led me to thinking that, and agreeing with what Carl and Ravengo had said, is that often what happens is conditions of practice seem to be intuitive for people. But my question is that actually accurate? So if we look at some of the research that's happening in motor learning, for example, research in the self-control of feedback arena, there was a study done in 2002 that asked, it was a follow-up. So basically what they did was they allowed learners to choose when they were to receive feedback from the experimenters regarding the task at hand, which happened to be just a positioning finger tap task, sorry. And they decided to follow up to try and figure out why was feedback being requested. And what they found was that in general, feedback was requested when learners perceived to have a good performance. And that actually for me seemed very counterintuitive, because as an athlete, for me, I always wanted to know what was I doing wrong, because I wanted to know how to fix it. So here's a case where my intuition was actually not supported by the evidence. And over a series of experiments, this particular perception of wanting to get information after good performance has been repeated. Now, there are some mixed results in this area of research, but what it did do is highlight the motivational aspect of feedback and how that could actually affect learning. And so from here, the recommendation from Fairbrother based on the literature is that feedback shouldn't exclusively focus on correcting errors, nor should it exclusively focus on confirming when someone has been successful, but really incorporating both of those things. So I thought what we could do today is kind of take a look at what a relatively common teaching approach was, and see if that particular approach should be updated based on recent research being performed in motor learning. So a common practice in teaching is that an instructor will describe how an action should be performed. They'll give instructions that typically refer to the body movements. So in this particular picture, you can see that the gentleman is swinging his arms and probably cueing his learners on that particular body movement. The instructor will select a practice task, and then as the students practice the task, they'll be given feedback to help correct their movement pattern in an attempt to improve their performance. If we look at the most recent literature, we want to see if that actually should change. So a couple of different areas of research that have been quite popular in recent years include self-control or autonomy. And what has been found is that when learners are allowed to choose or make decisions about either receiving feedback, watching a demonstration, viewing a video, the order in which they practice, the pacing of practice, the difficulty of a task, or whether or not to use an assistive device, what has been found is that that choice, or being given that choice, actually facilitates their learning. So a second area of research that actually is another area where intuition and evidence seem to collide is the notion of attentional focus. So the area of attentional focus, we can either direct our attentional focus either internally on body movements or externally on the effects or intended movement effects. And interestingly, typically what happens is as we are trying to improve a learner's movement form, intuitively we will focus their attention on a specific body part. And in fact, there was a study that looked at track and field athletes and found that 84.6% of track coaches actually did in fact use internal cues. But the research over the last 20 some odd years has actually shown that an external focus of attention better facilitates both learning and performance. And that has been demonstrated for both movement effectiveness and movement efficiency. And it has been demonstrated across a wide range of activities, regardless of health condition, age, and level of experience. So in this instance, words actually really matter. And if we want to optimize learning and performance, we want to tell our learners to push the ground away, for example, rather than push off harder with your foot. And in this particular picture, I just thought it was a really great representation of someone who is using this external focus in their performance, clearly looking at the target that they are trying to hit. So given the research in autonomy and the research in an external focus, what has come about recently in 2016 is a new theory proposed by Wolf and Luthwaite. And that theory is called the optimal theory, which stands for optimizing performance through intrinsic motivation and intention for learning. And in addition to the autonomy and external focus, they propose that enhanced expectancies, where learners are, where strategies are used to enhance an individual's expectation about how they will perform, are all important factors in the learning process. And in fact, it's been shown that an additive, when each factor, when the three factors are combined, there's actually an additive contribution to motor learning. And so this is a very recent theory that certainly has implications for physical education. Another area of research that has been picking up some speed in the literature is the constraints-led approach. Now, we know that the constraints-led approach has actually been around for a little while. Carl Newell introduced this notion of constraints in 1986. And what's been, a lot of the research has really been happening in the Australia, New Zealand area in this particular venue. But essentially, the notion is that that through the manipulation of constraints, it's possible to actually shape behaviors and promote skill acquisition. And so I always like this cartoon because it kind of demonstrates that notion. For some reason, my students never laugh at my cartoons, but perhaps you did, I'm not sure. So basically what has come about as a result of this research, and some of this again seems somewhat intuitive, but their learning can be facilitated through the use of small-sided games, through the use of scaling equipment. For example, low compression balls in tennis can actually facilitate youth tennis players' ability to play the game at more of an adult-like performance. Lightweight hockey pucks for youth hockey players facilitates their learning and ability to use or to perform tasks in hockey. And then some other information has come about from Rob Gray, where he changed the task criteria in baseball batting, where hitting over a barrier he was able to actually influence the launch angle in baseball batting, which was quite interesting. And then there have been a number of studies that look at situational factors and how we can manipulate those to develop tactical skills. And then finally, we can influence playing areas, such as decreasing the size of the playing area to promote ball control in soccer. And so there's actually been a plethora of research in this area in the last few years. One very interesting study that came about recently was how can we take this constraints-led approach and apply it into a physical education lesson? And what they did in this particular study was they had 42 undergraduates and they did a pre and post video of their hurdling technique. And the videos were assessed by 3 track and field coaches. And what the videos entailed were essentially, there were 3 or 4 people, students in the classroom, and they were racing over 3 hurdles over a 40-meter distance. And the lesson transpired, it was a 40-minute practice, and they created 2 learning experiences. And the goal of the first learning experience was to develop hurdling rhythm. And what they did was they created 6 lanes of 3 mini hurdles. And in the lanes, basically the hurdles, the distance between the hurdles got progressively longer. And they didn't give the students any instructions. They were permitted to pick their own lane for practice, but they were told 2 things. They were told to try to get 3 steps in between each hurdle, and they were told to try to run as fast as they could over the hurdles. And then they were given an opportunity to practice. And when they were found to be able to do 3 steps in between a hurdle, they were challenged to maybe perhaps go to a different lane to practice further. And they did this activity for 10 minutes. The second activity, the goal was to simulate a representative environment. And in this particular activity, what they did was they essentially practiced in race conditions over 3 hurdles, again, having the opportunity to pick the lane that they wanted to be in, that changed as a result of the distances in between the hurdles changed. And again, when they were able to successfully complete 3 hurdles, it was suggested to them that they might try a different lane. And what they found was in a 40-minute practice, there was a significant change in hurdling requirements. And in this particular slide, what I wanted to emphasize is these are basically a checklist of features for a lesson that have come about from research in the constraints-led approach that should be considered when designing a lesson. And you can see that for the practice of the task in a representative of the performance environment, they had the students running over the hurdles just like they would in a race, and they gave them an opportunity to explore that particular action. The constraint manipulated was the hurdle height and the interval in between the hurdles. They facilitated exploratory activities, and they also gave the students choice as to how they wanted to progress through the lesson. And then they weren't told, the students weren't told what to do. The students were told what to do, they weren't told how to do it. And these are all key features of the constraints-led approach. So if we look at common teaching practice that we had discussed earlier, and we look at the information that has come about from the research in the last few years, maybe some contemporary guidelines might actually update that to where the instructor actually prescribes a task or a problem and doesn't actually give the movement solution. And then instead of focusing the learner on intended movement effects, instead of focusing the learner on body movements, we should be focusing the learner on intended movement effects. We should be giving learner choices. We want to give feedback when learners ask for it so that they have autonomy. And then highlighting good aspects of task performance is supported by the literature as well. So a few barriers are in place that unfortunately sometimes this information doesn't actually get out to physical educators. And so I just listed a few things where movement scientists typically aren't collaborating with physical educators. Often in the research, we don't create situations that we can then pragmatically translate into a typical physical education situation. One thing that's a barrier is that often individuals will learn despite using any type of strategy. For example, the track and field athletes were clearly able to become elite with internal cueing. And so the whole notion is that motor learning really optimizes learning. And some other things that need to be considered is often the language is a little bit difficult when talking about like CLA, for example. And there's really few ready-made solutions that are easy to just kind of take and implement into a physical education type environment, because really a lot of the choices that we make using the motor learning research depends on what the particular situation happens to be. So some ideas for bridging the gap. I'm kind of running out of time here, but I just wanted to sort of throw out that maybe we need to try, we clearly need to find a way, a vehicle that we can deliver this information, but it has to be much more accessible in language, application, and visibility. And we also want to try and maybe shape some of those intuitions to be a little bit more informative. So from here, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to hand it over to Jane.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. You set a great scene for me. In fact, you just pretty much gave everything I would like to say, which I already knew what you're going to say, but I want to extend on that as a motor development person. I want to take a developmental perspective on just about everything Cheryl said. So in other words, what does it mean to take and look at our motor behavior as a developmentalist? So years ago, when I was teaching my motor development class, I came up with this idea that we needed to think about the development of motor skills in much the same way as we might think of this as climbing a mountain or going up a hill. And so you see that, first of all, it's important to understand that when a fifth grader comes into your class, that they have this whole history. Okay, they also have this sequence of things. So if I'm looking back at little kids and I say, okay, first you have to walk, then you have to run, then you have to hop and skip and jump and gallop and skip, as I say. But the idea is that one thing is being built upon another. So as we look at this idea of a mountain, we have to see this as a lifespan perspective, not just the sixth graders that you see or the third graders that you see, but all the way across their life. And then we have to see this as a sequence of one thing after another, which is why, of course, our curricula should be built sequentially, all right? And then the other thing is this idea of cumulative. That is that what you learned in one skill, you may be able to use in the next skill. All right, and then the other point, of course, is that we're not all skillful in everything. So it's really a range of things. So you might be a very good tennis player, but a pretty bad gymnast, or vice versa. Or you might be a great dancer, but not necessarily a good swimmer. So motor skills are on a range of mountains, not on just one mountain, and you just go on top up on it. So as a developmentalist, I want to put my glasses on and I want to see the learner on this mountain, okay? And I want to see them all having a different rate. So everything that Cheryl was just talking about, you have to look at your learner in your classroom, your students, and think about how is it that that particular student is doing something. Like one of your students may get it in like a second, and the next student is really struggling to get it. But as a developmentalist, you're thinking about this as some kind of progression that's going to happen. Some of us are just a little slower than others, okay? The other important thing is to remember that they have a history. They come to your class with a history of their motor skills. And sometimes that history gives them bad habits, but in fact, you need to appreciate the fact that they come with this history. All right, this is the Newell 1986 paper that Cheryl was alluding to. And this is this triangle, the constraints triangle, the organism being the person and all the things that come with that person, like how high they are, how chubby they might be, how strong they are, and so on. The environment being not only the physical environment, but the social cultural environment that they're in. But the thing I want to focus on today is on the task, and the comments I want to make are about the task. So to me, whenever I talk to physical educators, or I am trying to myself or talking to other people, you're basically talking to a person. And Cheryl made a wonderful point about, kind of telling somebody how to do it. Basically your need to find the way to talk to someone's central nervous system, to their neuromuscular system. And I think that the language that we need to use is the language of tasks. What is it that you need to do? So I'm going to keep on that focus all the way through here. So what is the task at hand? As Cheryl had that wonderful graph that she has of the different things that can be part of the task dimension. So you could just stick this in here. I'll just give you the short version, which is it's going to be defined by the game, it's defined by the teacher, it's defined by the equipment or the needs that you have. But those are the constraints that you're going to try to manipulate in terms of doing instruction. But one of the things I want to, most people probably would have thought I was going to talk a lot about the fundamental motor skills. The fundamental motor patterns are, in fact, of course, the building blocks of our later culturally promoted motor skills. So, throwing becomes a pitch, it becomes a tennis serve, and so on. Those patterns of coordination are built into the kinds of things that we promote within our culture. But there's a part of this that I really want to sort of take us on a little slightly different path, because what we've been talking about is motor learning and motor development laid on top of that. I want to lay on top of that developmental perspective, motor control, something that we don't often talk about as much, but if we see what we're talking about, I want to talk about posture, which is sitting behind all the actions we have. Back in the 1900s, Charles Sherrington said, posture follows movement like a shadow. That's, it's almost poetry. That is, as you're just sitting there right now, or you're wandering around your space where you're listening to this or something, all the while you're doing actions, your postural system is keeping you where you are from falling over or being able to be in a certain position. So everything we do, from sitting in a chair to the kinds of skills we have, posture is always there, all right? And that's one of the things we want to sort of push forward here. So it's not just not falling over. Okay, there's stability. There's two parts of postural control. One is stability, which is keeping your center of mass over your base of support. And of course, we've seen wonderful examples of this in the Olympics just recently, but we see this every day, whatever you're doing. The other part of posture is something that we often don't think about, and it's the orientation of the body to a desired position. So if I want to go down and pick up something off my floor, I'm changing my posture, and I have to control that and the orientation of my body parts to each other. For example, the cellist or the diver. All of these body parts have to be in a certain orientation to each other, and that is part of the postural control, as well as just keeping your balance, that is, not falling over. So I want to talk about what makes up postural control. And of course, the first thing everybody thinks of when they think of posture is your vestibular system. Okay, it's this inner ear, the semicircular canals, and there's utricles and otoliths as well. But there are two other parts that are really critical to postural sensors. The first is vision. Of course, we know this, but we don't really think about it so much. But, as you well know, one of the tests of a balance is standing on one foot with your eyes open and your eyes closed. All right, yes, because we think that that's an important thing to take away to see how your balance is maintained. But it's also something that we need to focus on, no pun intended, that is one of the major sources of information for balance control. The other one is both touch receptors and the muscle and joint receptors. Sometimes both of these together are called somato sensation. That is, you are touching, that is the pressure receptors, such as in this diagram here, the child standing on the floor, and also, of course, your joints and your muscle spindles and so on. All of those are providing information back to the brain about where you are and how everything is oriented. All right, now let's go back and think about this as a motor control problem. So the postural control system is actually made up of three parts. First, there's the sensors, which are detecting where your position is. Secondly, are the muscles that have to make the correction. All right, they are going to change the orientation of where you are or keep you stable. But where are they getting their commands? How is it that besides a reflex, of course, how are these muscles being modulated or controlled? And that is the most important part. That is that the brain has to develop a system that controls posture, both in estimating where you are and also predicting where you are. And this is sometimes referred to as an internal model, depending on your language. But the idea is that through development, you're developing this kind of schematic, as it were, a schema for postural control that takes the sensory information, sends the message back out to the muscles about what to do about it. And of course, in the background, there are reflexes that are involved in posture, of course, but there's also these estimations of where you want to be. So one of the studies we did a few years ago, I loved it, was driven by an undergraduate student when Dance Dance Revolution was around. But this is about sequencing. All of our motor skills are sequenced, whether it's tossing the ball and then hitting it, or dropping the birdie and then hitting it, or whatever the sequence might be, from playing a musical instrument to sport skills. This is a learning of a foot sequence. But also, in order to do that, we were looking at the postural control of this. And it was an important part of this whole sequence learning. And we've done quite a number of papers on sequence learning. And it's quite interesting because, of course, this changes developmentally. But part of what sits behind that sequence is the importance of postural control. So what can we do to enhance or promote postural control every day when you're working with your students? Okay. What are the kinds of task constraints? Well, pretty much, you can do this, but it doesn't take much to think about it. But I'm trying to argue, if you're talking about, and this is again goes back to that external focus control that Cheryl was talking about, focusing on things that change the task for the performer. So reduce the base of support from one foot to walking on small beams and so on. Change the orientation. The little child in the middle here is on a foam board, which is different sensors coming from the feet, but also he's leaning down and picking up something off the floor. There's lots of that goes on in a physical education class. We need to promote it as part of what the child is learning as they become more motorically skillful. And of course, things like reducing senses, tipping upside down also changes your vestibular system, but the somato sensation and so on. I am not suggesting with this little cartoon here that we should be blindfolding our students. Please do not take that point of view, but certainly closing your eyes as you're standing still so that you don't hurt yourself would be something. And of course, kids can squint their eyes and really not close their eyes. And of course, dynamic and static balance are important. All right. And I can't pass up an opportunity in talking to people who are teachers to talk about what I've just said about the developmental perspective and Muscombe-Mostyn's slanty rope. I mean, his idea of the slanty rope is exactly what I'm talking about, that every child needs to be able to enter the task that you've set for them at different levels. So in the case of the ropes laid on the gym floor, that in fact, these are on a slant so that you can jump across where you think you can be successful. And of course, you as a teacher would try to push them to be a little higher. And as a short person, I would really have liked basketball hoops that were scaled. When I was growing up, they were not scaled. They were just where Naismith put them, and that's where they were, and they were going to stay there. Now, of course, you can adjust all these, but target sizes. And then, of course, I love this playground where all of these different structures to climb on are different places, different widths, and so on. Again, making the point that it's not just task constraints, but developmentally set task constraints using a notion of slanty. So just to sort of sum up, one of the things that was set to us is how do we do this? And what I'm suggesting is not only do we need to come with our eyeglasses as developmentalists, but also to work collaboratively with movement scientists. And some of this happens because we have physical educators in our graduate classes, or even in our undergraduate classes. I always had undergraduate students working with us in the laboratory, and they came in with that dance revolution idea came from them. Certainly I wasn't doing it, but the idea is that it was a way to do something that was out there, real, and was important to the learning of that. And of course, one of the things I think we really need to do, and I think expert teachers do understand what the language of the learner's neuromuscular system is. Many a dance teacher that I had really did understand where my external focus should be. And always, of course, I was not a good dancer, but they knew how to talk to my nervous system. Unfortunately, I just didn't have a very good responsive nervous system. No, but I think we need to find ways to help all children develop motor skillfulness. Thank you. Sorry, I've got to unshare this. And over to you, Dale.
Thank you. I need to upload wherever it's at. Oh, there it is. Okay, thank you, Jane and Cheryl. My expectation was that I was going to learn something by your talks, and I did. So I want to thank you, especially for a late Friday afternoon during retirement. And so my task today is I'm going to take a somewhat different approach than the last two presenters. And you'll see this in just a moment. But the task at hand is to share what my vision is for future translation motor behavior research to practice. And so there are some basic assumptions and principles that I want to share with you in terms of how I'm developing this vision. First of all, we're going to talk about evidence-based practices, something that has been around now for, I don't know how many years, 15 years or so, especially in the medical community and public health. Certainly, it has been involved in education for a number of years. But to be an evidence-based practice, evidence-based practices have to be supported by multiple. In other words, one study does not prove anything. Everybody knows that. But you have to focus some point on replication of those studies. And if I only get one thing achieved today, is to convince a few of you that find a couple of good studies that you really value and replicate them and then publish them. That's the only way that practice that was the focus of the study can really be considered an evidence-based practice. Secondly, it has to be from high quality studies. In other words, high levels of reliability of your measures, high implementation fidelity. All of those are needed. And also utilize experimental research designs that allow us to infer cause and effect. And then lastly, is that the differences between the experimental and control groups have got to be meaningful. It's not good enough just to be statistically significant. Everybody knows that statistical significance is heavily influenced by sample size, where effect size is not. And so I think many people now, especially in the adaptive physical activity community or intervention literature, are required to include effect size statistics. And an effect size, for example, if you have an effect size of 0.5, that unit of measurement of the effect size is actually a standard deviation. So you take any study where the effect size between the experimental and control group was 0.5, that means, hopefully, that the average child in the experimental group was better off on your outcome variable by a half a standard deviation compared to the average child in the control group. So they're easy to understand, but we need to be using them on a regular basis. It's quite common for teachers to use, and I certainly did this when I was a young lad, use personal experience, traditional approaches, and expert opinions. So in other words, if they attend the National Adaptive Physical Activity Conference in California, they learn a lot of good things from experts. But that doesn't mean the expert is telling us what evidence-based practices are. So hopefully you're going to be learning something about evidence-based practices as well, and then uptake and use them. Secondly, is motor behavior research typically conduct their research in a highly well-controlled lab with trained lab assistants. That's what we all do. In that particular case, if your goal is to, based on the results, is to hopefully transfer those results to the real world in a physical education setting, you want to make sure the effect size is very large. because you're going to lose once you transfer to a physical education class. We all know there's a lot of constraints. There's a lot of distractions. The people implementing it may not have high fidelity. You just don't know. There's a lot of uncontrolled factors there. So hopefully the well-controlled study starts off with a very high effect size. Thirdly, we do not know enough about evidence-based practices in motor behavior for physical education teachers can use, especially in the APE classes. So yes, we know some things, but there's not enough high quality research and replication of those high quality studies to really be able to label it as an evidence-based practice. And so we need to continue to improve on that. First of all, too many schools no longer give us permission to come into the schools to conduct our research. I don't blame them. Here in Ann Arbor at University of Michigan, you would be surprised how many researchers go to the Ann Arbor Public Schools to request permission to do research in their schools. It's not just in kinesiology or physical education, it's throughout the whole university. And so they pretty much have stopped allowing people to come in unless it's a major funded study. And so that's very unfortunate. One of the strategies I've learned over the last decade or more is when I'm turned down by a school to come in, one of the things I've learned, you'd be surprised how willing religious schools are. If you're doing a study that the school personnel think are of value to the child and their family, they're going to jump on it. They want you to come in. And so don't hesitate going to religious related schools. Secondly, it's too few replications. I mentioned something that, again, if only one thing comes out of my presentation today for some of you, is you take on a good study that's been done, but it's not been replicated, and your goal is to replicate the study. And then by doing more replications, you can feel more confident in the generalizability of those results. Thirdly is building unrelated bricks. We all, many of us, when I was a young lad, certainly I know I built multiple bricks, and those bricks were not related, unfortunately. I wasn't building a line of research. And so I would certainly hope that more of us start to build structures of our research. In other words, one study should relate to another study, should relate to another study. An example of this is our bicycle training research that we've done over quite a few years. One study helped us to establish research questions for the next year. And so there is a line of research about bicycle training and the benefits to their health and physical activity. Research has suggested that evidence-based practices for many professionals can take up to 17 years to become a common practice by the profession. And I'm sure it's that way in physical education and education in general. This suggestion of 17 years, I'm confident, has not been done in education. It was done more in medical practices. But the point here is there's a very large research to practice gap. The movement of evidence-based practices into routine professional practice is not spontaneous. It doesn't just happen. It requires a focused effort. And the best example I can give you, some of you, especially since I saw there were at least 5 or 6 of my previous doctoral students or postdocs listening in, you're very familiar with our treadmill training in infants with Down syndrome. It was quite interesting that when we first started presenting the results and publishing our first paper, I had a doctoral student that was a pediatric PT. And she said, Dale, you've got to look at and this was when the internet was pretty young. They had email listservs. And she said, you've got to access these and read them. See what they're saying about your treadmill training. it was all negative. Every one of them was negative. They thought for some reason, our research, we were trying to replace pediatric therapy. I don't know where they got that thought. It certainly wasn't from us. And then also, they thought we were going to do detrimental harm to the eventual walking gait patterns of infants with Down syndrome. Now, why they thought that, I don't understand. Now, the one thing they did not know when they said that was that we already had that data. Certainly when we're doing this funded research, we're going to collect data on their walking gait patterns and mechanics. And so we knew already that the treadmill trained experimental group had much better walking gait. But until we actually presented that data and published it, then all of a sudden, those emails turned very, very positive. So my point here is the uptake of treadmill training or any evidence-based practice does not take place automatically. It's got to be systematic, and you've got to really, with today's Facebook pages and all the other social media, you can promote those much quicker than what we could early on. That leads me to the last point on this, and that is lead into implementation science, something that's just recently begun to show up on education research, but it's been available for a number of years in biological medical science and public health research. Implementation science is the scientific study of methods and procedures to promote the systematic uptake of evidence-based practice. In other words, what do we have to do to intervene that professionals start using these evidence-based practices? And if they do, we assume that they're going to improve the quality and effectiveness of physical education instruction. In the past year, University of Michigan School of Kinesiology hired an implementation science faculty member. And so all of our students are going to be introduced to that from undergraduate through graduate training. Implementation science certainly requires the involvement of both quantitative data and qualitative methods to identify, first of all, factors. Why is it that professionals aren't using the evidence-based practices? What is it in the child that might be constraining it? What is it in the teacher? Teacher's number of years of experience, and also the school, what their policies are. It may be, for example, whenever I train large groups of professionals to implement and interpret the test of gross motor development, I always mention the fact that schools never, ever, ever have given you an adequate amount of time to do a decent assessment of their motor skills. And so it may be the school policy, even though it's an evidence-based practice, may take a little bit longer, or maybe they perceive it as taking a little bit longer. And then certainly we've got to then follow up with quality interventions to increase the uptake. But you learn all of this through the implementation science. And so I really recommend that you look into this. And again, if I was back in as a young lad, I would invest a lot of time looking at how to do this. There's a paper, Justin Moore came out in 2018, where I think they do a pretty good job in applying implementation science to physical activity during school. In other words, if you read the literature on trying to increase children's physical activity, it doesn't always work, unfortunately. And so what they're doing is they're looking at methods to increase physical activity just before school starts, as they're arriving at school, during the school day, and then just after school. And they're using what they discovered through implementation science to implement that program. And so I really recommend you look into that paper. So my view, we're supposed to prevent our views. And so my view for this potential special interest group at SHAPE should consider a number of things. First of all, implement training seminars. This special interest group will be part of the research consortium, so it's research oriented. And so implement training seminars in areas to promote high quality experimental studies. For example, do some training, bring in an expert in mixed methods, research and analysis. I will give you a reference in my last slide to the University of Michigan group that you can join if you want. It's an international group that has lots of different disciplines represented, but they're all doing mixed methods research and analyses. And you can learn a lot that applies to kinesiology, physical education, and so forth. So look for that in my reference at the end. Make an effort to discuss and establish effect size standards. We do not have standards of effect size. We have some guidelines, but if I'm doing a study on treadmill training and the effect size for promoting earlier independent walking is 0.5, is that really high enough? I argued it was, but I don't know. And so journal editors should insist that you give a good rationale for why the effect size that you're arguing is meaningful. And the best way is to have standards. And so one of the things this special interest group could do is organize over a course of a year or two serious discussions of what it takes in terms of intervention and treatment studies, as one example. Thirdly, is have a SHAPE annual session to highlight or summarize current or new evidence-based practices and involve physical education teachers included in the discussions. And as a result of the discussions, hopefully come up with a priority list of future research questions that the researchers want, but also the physical education teachers. That will benefit everybody. And then fourthly, for what I said earlier, is try to work with physical education teachers to help get permission for more research involved in their physical education classes. This will not be easy. It's a timing factor, but the physical education teacher has to be on board. If they're not on board, you have no chance of getting permission. So my references that I give you, the Justin Moore, a good introduction to implementation science for the non-specialists is a good introduction that I read. And then implementing exercise in healthcare settings, the potential for implementation science. And so it's within a physical activity kind of area. And then you can click on and go to Google and search for www.mixedmethods.org, and you'll see their whole webpage, and you can sign up. They have lots of workshops, lots of seminars and discussions. So I think I will end there. And thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you, Dale. Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Cheryl. Like, I think I have to go back and redesign my classes now. My head is full. It's so wonderful.